Thanksgiving was always my mother's favorite holiday, but this year her seat sat empty, and so did my heart. The wind shook the old shutters of our rented cottage in Brattleboro as Eli and I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing apples for the pie. He asked if we could add extra cinnamon like Grandma used to. I nodded, brushing a curl behind his ear, and tried to smile. His eyes carried a brightness I didn't have the strength to mimic. I hadn't told Eli much about the letter I found yesterday, not that he would understand the weight of it. It was tucked now in my coat pocket, the old ivory envelope worn at the edges, addressed in Grandma's familiar script. I hadn't dared open it yet. There hadn't been time, or maybe I hadn't wanted to make the time. Bev knocked on the back door around mid-morning, balancing a plate of ginger cookies wrapped in wax paper. Her gray curls were tucked into a knitted beret, and her scarf bore the deep red of dried cranberries. She entered like she always did, without ceremony, but full of presents. "I brought these for the boys at the hardware store, but they'll survive with a dozen less," she said, placing the cookies on the table. She noticed the half-rolled crust and flour on Eli's cheek. "Looks like your sous chef's doing a fine job." Eli grinned and held up his cinnamon-dusted hands like a surgeon in prep. Bev winked at him, then turned to me. "You all packed for tonight?" I exhaled. "Pie's almost ready, just gathering some courage to go with it." She sat without being asked and took a sip from the chipped teacup I kept ready just for her. "Truth always finds its way, especially during the holidays," she said, stirring her tea slowly, "even if it takes its sweet time." The cottage smelled of nutmeg and quiet tension. Outside, someone was blowing leaves into neat piles along Hemlock Street. Inside, I folded the old pie carrier and stared at the lace doily Grandma had sewn into its lining. I hadn't used it since the last Thanksgiving we'd had together, before the hospital visits, before Sierra started taking over, before the house no longer felt like mine to walk into. Bev took a small notebook from her coat and slid it toward me. "Found this in a box of old work files. Just a list of contacts from my years with the law office. Might come in handy." I nodded. My fingers grazed the envelope again through my coat pocket. "Ivy," Bev said gently, "don't wait too long to read it. Some letters speak better in your own quiet." Later that afternoon, as the pie cooled on the windowsill and Eli packed his school drawing into a manila folder for Grandma and Grandpa, I paused. The envelope lay on the counter now, just beside the card of index recipes Grandma used to keep by the stove. I picked it up, ran my thumb over the seal, hesitated, then slid it gently into the inner pocket of my wool coat. "I'll read it after dinner," I told myself. After the toast. After the stories. After pretending for a few hours that I wasn't invisible at my own family's table. The sun began to lower behind the trees. The wind quieted. I zipped Eli's jacket, handed him the pie, and gathered the last of our things. Before stepping out, I glanced once more at the letter, now hidden over my heart. As Eli tugged my sleeve, I looked up at the big white house on Hemlock Drive and whispered, "Let's get this over with." The scent of rosemary ham filled the air, but the real feast tonight was for pride, not family. Dolores greeted us with a brief kiss on the cheek that never quite touched skin. Her makeup was immaculate. Her earrings matched the centerpiece. "You're right on time," she said, then added, "Well, a few minutes behind, but we haven't started." Inside, the Holloway house looked like a catalog spread. The long dining table had been extended with an extra leaf, covered in pressed ivory linen, and set with the china only brought out for holidays. There were gold-accented name cards at every place, tied with twine and sprigs of rosemary. Eli hovered behind me, holding the pie carefully in both hands. Clay passed by in his navy blazer, offering a nod that felt more like a judgment than a greeting. "Smells good," he said. "Store-bought or homemade?" "Homemade," I answered. "Impressive," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Sierra swept in, clicking on heels that echoed through the hardwood floors. She looked radiant in deep green velvet, a necklace catching the light as she moved. She hugged Eli with calculated warmth and complimented his new haircut. "Isn't this fun?" she said, leaning close to me. "The first big dinner without Grandma. Mom really outdid herself." I didn't answer. I was watching Eli eye the place cards, searching for his name. I pointed him toward the kid's table set at the far end of the room, just past the archway. He smiled politely, then shuffled off, still clutching the drawing he made for Grandma and Grandpa. Henry stood near the fireplace, sipping from a cut glass tumbler. His cardigan and pressed slacks made him look like a photo from another decade. He didn't say much when I approached, only nodded once. "You're here," he said. "Good." The air was thick with tradition and tension. When we all sat down, a hush fell as Mr. Avery, our family's longtime estate attorney, was introduced. Sierra beamed. Dolores patted her hand. Clay raised his glass before anything had been said. "I want to thank you all," Mr. Avery began, "for allowing me to speak briefly during your holiday gathering. Your mother left specific instructions for how she wanted this handled. It was her wish that the reading take place at Thanksgiving to honor the season of gratitude." The irony twisted sharp in my chest. As executor of her estate, I can confirm that the final will, signed and notarized last July, named Sierra Bennett as the sole beneficiary of the Holloway home, personal savings, and jewelry collection. He paused, then continued without meeting my eyes. Additionally, there is a written acknowledgement for Ivy Holloway, expressing appreciation for her care during Mrs. Holloway's final months. No one spoke. Sierra folded her hands neatly, her nails painted a holiday red. Dolores dabbed the corner of her eye with a monogram napkin, more for drama than grief. Clay smiled slightly, already satisfied. The server passed me a small envelope with my name written in Grandma's cursive. I opened it slowly, aware of everyone's gaze flickering, then dismissing. Inside was a single note card. No money, no keepsake, just one line, linked in gentle loops. "Thank you for your quiet care." I swallowed. The pie I brought now sat untouched at the center of the table, its crust still holding warmth. After the meal, Dolores leaned toward Sierra. "Your Aspen itinerary?" she asked, like none of the rest had occurred. Sierra pulled out her phone. "We're skiing Christmas week. Clay booked the suite at the lodge where we stayed 2 years ago." Clay added, "Hard to get those rooms now, with the wait list." I reached for my water glass and my hand brushed against the envelope again, the one with the letter I hadn't yet read. I held it there, grounding myself. "Eli," Henry said across the table, surprising everyone. "What's that you brought for us?" Eli brightened, holding up his drawing. "It's a picture of Grandma and me baking cookies. I used colored pencils and added glitter." Henry nodded slowly. "She loved baking. She'd have liked that." Dolores smiled, then turned. "Brian won the chess regionals last weekend," she said, referencing Sierra's son. "We're hoping he qualifies for state." Sierra jumped in. "He's already practicing with a coach from Dartmouth." Eli shrank slightly in his seat. I squeezed his shoulder. "Eli's teacher says he has a gift for math," I said, keeping my voice even. "He's also learning cursive early." No one responded. Clay took another bite of ham. "We should toast to tradition," he said. "After all, this table's been here for 3 generations." Dolores lifted her glass. "To my family," she said, "and to the ones who uphold our name with dignity." That stung. When dessert came, Sierra placed a store-bought cranberry tart on the table. Dolores gushed over the presentation. "No one touched my pie." "Not quite your mother's original recipe," Dolores said as she sampled a bite. "You changed something." "I added a little orange zest," I replied, "to brighten the flavor." "Traditions should be kept as traditions," she said, setting her fork down. I kept my smile still. Yes, family traditions should be treasured, especially when family members cherish and respect each other. That silenced the room, even if only for a beat. I didn't cry, but that letter in my other pocket suddenly felt a lot heavier. Some truths don't knock. They slip quietly under the door and wait to be noticed. That night, after Eli had fallen asleep with his glitter drawing curled under one arm, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the radiator and the occasional creak of old pipes. Outside, flurries tapped gently against the window. The letter sat in front of me now, freed from my coat pocket, still sealed. I lit a single candle. I wasn't sure if it was for the mood or the courage. When I finally broke the wax, the paper inside trembled as much as my fingers. Dear Ivy, it began, if you're reading this, it means something has happened that I feared might happen. I asked for my will to be changed back to what I felt was fair, what I had wanted from the start, but I was not sure they'd let it be. I swallowed, the heat from the candle flickering across my face. I saw how you cared for me. You never asked for anything, even when you had less than anyone. I asked Mr. Kiersey to make sure you and your sister shared equally. If that's not what happened, then find Bev. She'll know what to do. The last line was underlined twice. You're more than quiet care. You are my voice. I sat there for a long time. I don't know if I cried. Maybe I just let the silence do the crying for me. The next morning, I made apple muffins and walked across the frosty sidewalk to Bev's house. A wreath of faded pine cones hung on her door. She opened it before I knocked, like she'd known I'd come. I was wondering when you'd show, she said, stepping aside. Her house smelled like lemon oil and dusted books. A tabby cat wound between her feet as I followed her to the small kitchen. The sun lit up the white lace curtains and the worn linoleum floor where two chairs waited like old friends. I handed her the letter and watched as she read in silence. Her brow furrowed, then relaxed. When she looked up, her eyes were glossy. She trusted you, Bev said. She trusted you too, I answered. Bev stood and disappeared into the hallway. I heard her unlocking an old cabinet, the hinges creaking. She returned with a slim manila folder, its corners bent from age and habit. I was cleaning out some old things when I found this, she said, laying it down in front of me. I kept it because, well, something about how Sierra handled everything never sat right. Inside was a copy of a will, signed, dated, 3 months before the final one. It listed me and Sierra as equal beneficiaries. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandma's. I remember her saying, Bev added, that fairness wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, about not letting the quiet ones disappear. I ran my fingers over the signature. Do you think this matters? I mean, legally? Bev shrugged gently. Morally, it matters a great deal. And legally, Mr. Kiersey may have thoughts. He's retired but sharp as ever. Eli came in after school, cheeks red from the wind, backpack bouncing. Bev made him cocoa without asking. He talked about his math class and how Mrs. Green let him draw on the whiteboard. At some point, he tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Can I show Bev the drawing?" "Of course," I said. He ran to his backpack and brought out the crumpled artwork from last night. "This is Grandma and me," he told Bev. "We used to make cookies. Mama says she's in heaven now, but I think maybe she's also in the smell of cinnamon." Bev looked at me then. "He's a poet, that one." I nodded. "He gets it from someone he barely got to know." Later, when Eli was flipping through Bev's collection of old National Geographics, she leaned close. "Ivy," she said softly, this could stir things up." "I know." "Are you ready for that?" "No," I answered and meant it. "But I think I'm ready for the truth to be seen." Bev squeezed my hand and stood to fetch another cup of tea. Bev looked me square in the eye. "This might just change everything. Grandma always said her apple pie could settle arguments. I brought mine hoping it might just stir up the truth." It was the first Sunday of Advent, and Dolores insisted on her annual holiday kickoff dinner, as if forced joy could cover the seams of grief and tension. Their home was decked in coordinated reds and golds, the kind of Christmas cheer that felt more like showroom staging than sentiment. Fresh pine garland wrapped the banisters, candlelight glinted off polished silver. The house looked perfect, too perfect. I stood on the porch with Eli beside me, our breath fog in the air. I held the pie like it was an offering or maybe a shield. Inside my coat pocket, beneath a pair of knit gloves, the copy of Grandma's earlier will pressed like a heartbeat. Sierra opened the door in an ivory sweater dress, her diamond studs sparkling under the foyer light. "Oh, you made your pie," she said, the smile on her face rigid, polite. "We already have dessert, but that's fine." She ushered us in before I could respond. Eli peeled off his coat, scanning the room for Grandpa. In the dining room, Dolores was adjusting the centerpiece, a tall vase filled with dried cranberries and gold-dipped pine cones. Clay poured wine and said something low that made Sierra laugh. Henry sat by the fireplace, one foot crossed over the other, a glass of eggnog in hand. He nodded toward me with the same measured expression I remembered from childhood piano recitals, interested but always slightly apart. Dinner passed in a familiar blur of surface-level conversation, work talk, travel plans, something about Brian applying early to Yale. Eli tried to chime in about his winter play at school, but Clay changed the subject to ski conditions in Vermont. I waited until the plates were cleared and Dolores lit the tapered candles for dessert. That's when I placed the envelope on the table. "I brought something else," I said. "Not just pie." Henry glanced at the envelope, then at me. Sierra stiffened slightly. Dolores continued slicing cranberry tart. "This is a copy of Grandma's original will, the one she wrote before the changes were made last summer." I kept my voice steady, though my hands tightened on my lap. Sierra gave a short laugh. "Oh, Ivy, please don't make this into a scene." "It's not a scene," I said quietly. "It's a correction." Clay's brow furrowed. "Did you get this from that neighbor of yours? The one who smells like mothballs and talks to cats?" Bev's name didn't deserve that tone. I didn't dignify it with an answer. "She left everything to Sierra," Dolores said sharply. "That was her final wish." "Maybe," I replied, "but not her truest one." Henry cleared his throat but said nothing. I pulled out Grandma's letter and laid it beside the will. "She wrote this by hand, told me to find Bev, that she'd know what to do." Sierra's smile faded into something tighter. "That letter's sentimental at best. It wouldn't hold in court." "I'm not going to court," I said, glancing at Eli, who was watching from the end of the table, his feet swinging from the tall chair. "I'm not here for revenge. I just want to be seen." The room stilled. "She said I was her voice," I continued, "and I intend to speak gently, but clearly." Dolores finally set down her fork. "We all grieve in different ways, Ivy." "Yes," I agreed. "Some of us stay up all night with her when she can't breathe. Some of us miss a lot of meetings. And some of us keep silent while the will is changed under pressure." Henry flinched at that. Sierra shot him a quick glance. Clay scoffed. "This is absurd. You're bringing this up now during a holiday meal?" Eli, bless him, chose that exact moment to speak. "So, being kind doesn't count for anything?" The question dropped like a pebble in water, small but widening. Henry looked at him. Something in his posture shifted. "No," he said slowly. "It counts for more than you know." Silence wrapped around the room, not angry this time, just real. I smiled gently at her son and reached for the pie server. "Anyone want a slice of Grandma's recipe?" I used her handwriting as my guide. No one spoke for a second. Then Henry nodded once. "I'll take a piece." Dolores looked as if she might protest, but said nothing. As I sliced into the crust, the scent of cinnamon and orange zest drifted into the space between us, bridging just a bit of what had felt unbridgeable. Henry placed his napkin down slowly. "I remember the first will. She said it felt right. I should have listened." The first snow came with no warning, just like the truths we'd buried under family pride. I watched from the kitchen window as the first flakes tumbled gently from the pale sky, drifting over the rooftops and blanketing the maple tree outside our fence. Eli had already bundled himself in his navy coat and was clumsily tying his scarf when I handed him a brown paper lunch sack with 2 turkey sandwiches, one for him and one, he insisted, for the crossing guard he liked. "He says my drawings make his day," Eli explained. I smiled and kissed the top of his head. "So does kindness." After he left, the house felt heavier, as if the snow outside had pressed it deeper into the earth. I stood still in the kitchen long after the door clicked shut, looking down at the envelope Bev had returned to me the night before. The truth was now on paper. 2 papers, actually. The letter from Grandma and the earlier copy of her will. 2 voices from the past refusing to stay, buried. By mid-morning, I met Bev at the corner of Main and Elm. She wore her red wool hat pulled low and handed me a thermos of spiced tea with clove. "Figured your nerves would need it more than your hands," she said with a wink. The law office sat between a shuttered florist and a barber shop closed for renovations. I hadn't walked through its doors since my early 20s, back when I still thought family and fairness traveled hand in hand. Inside, time seemed slower. The same leather chairs, the same brass frame paintings. Even the front desk still held a jar of peppermints in a dish that Bev confessed she once refilled by hand. Mr. Kiersey greeted us from behind his desk, rising slowly but with grace. His hair had thinned since I last saw him, but his voice still held the same steadiness that had once calmed my grandmother through estate forms and home refinancing. "Ivy," he said, shaking my hand warmly. "It's been a while." Bev leaned her cane against the chair and sat beside me. I laid the letter and will copy on the desk, smoothing the folds that had grown from too many readings. "I believe," Bev said gently, "these deserve a second look." He picked up the letter first, reading without interruption. Then the will, his eyes narrowing at the signature line, the date. His fingers paused over a small handwritten note in the margin. "Revisit Clause 4, equal shares." "I remember this," he said, tapping the page. "Your grandmother called me that week. She said she felt torn. She'd already seen pressure. From Sierra, mostly. But she wanted fairness. This is what she called the true one." I looked at Bev, who nodded silently. My throat tightened. Kiersey leaned back in his chair. The second will was notarized, yes, but the emotional conditions surrounding it, they weren't invisible. I sensed it even then. "Why didn't you object?" I asked, more softly than I expected. "I just announced my retirement," he replied. "I didn't want to get between siblings, not without solid evidence, and I didn't think anyone would care enough to fight for it." "I didn't fight," I said. "I just stayed quiet." Bev gave my hand a squeeze. "You stayed kind. That's not the same thing." We were just starting to talk about next steps when the door creaked. A gust of cold slipped in before Henry stepped into the room, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Sorry I'm late," he said, looking at me, then at Kiersey. "I heard you were here." My stomach tightened. I hadn't invited him, but somehow I wasn't surprised he'd found out. Kiersey gestured toward the empty chair beside me. Henry hesitated, then sat. "I remember that first will," he said quietly. "The one with equal shares. Your grandmother told me about it." I said nothing, waiting. She said it felt right, that it reflected what she believed, not what she was being told to believe. I finally turned toward him. "Then why didn't you stop the change?" Henry looked down at his gloves. "Because I didn't want to unravel everything. I thought if we just kept things smooth, it would all pass." "It did pass," I said. "Right over me." The silence that followed was sharper than anything said aloud. Then Henry leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I was wrong, Ivy, about a lot of things, about you, about what it means to be the strong one in the family." My heart didn't leap. It didn't soften instantly, but it cracked open just enough. "She asked me to be her voice," I said, "and I waited too long." Henry nodded. "Then let me add mine to yours, if it helps, if it means something." Kiersey folded his hands. "There may not be a legal path to undo the second will, but there is a moral one, an open letter, a correction from within the family. Those things hold weight too, especially in small towns like this." Henry looked at me. "Would you write it with me?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'll think about it." The snow had picked up outside. As Bev and I left the office, our boots crunched softly in fresh powder. The town looked still, covered in gentle white. It reminded me of the kind of snow Grandma loved, quiet, clean, forgiven. As I step outside into the white stillness, I whisper to Bev, "Maybe this is the kind of snow that sticks." Not all inheritances come in the form of money. Some come as open doors, shared coffee, and hands that don't let go. The Holloway hearth smelled of cinnamon and melted butter. Light spilled from its windows onto the snow-covered sidewalk, golden and soft against the winter dusk. Inside, our second-hand tables were set with mismatched mugs and stacks of napkins bearing quotes in Grandma's handwriting. One near the register read, "Kindness doesn't cost, but it pays well." The bakery was humming, with low conversation and the gentle clatter of coffee cups. Bev moved easily behind the counter in her apron, embroidered with tiny red cardinals, pouring coffee for a couple in their 70s who came in every Tuesday just to sit near the warm. Her limp had grown more noticeable this winter, but she never complained. Not once. Eli had taken charge of the chalkboard sign out front. Today's message in crooked capital letters read, "Try our snowflake scones," with a doodle of a snowman that looked suspiciously like Mr. Kiersey. A year had passed since that Advent dinner, and while some days still carried echoes of the past, most of them were filled with new sounds, laughter, sugar being sifted, and Bev's soft hums of 1950s radio songs while she worked. We hadn't spoken to Sierra since the letter was sent. One Henry and I wrote together, explaining what had been found and what could no longer be ignored. It hadn't started a war, but it hadn't repaired anything either. And maybe that was fine. Not all broken things begged for glue. Dolores and Henry wrote back weeks later. The envelope was handwritten, the script shaky. "Dear Ivy and Eli," it began, "we are sorry. We see now that silence is a kind of choosing, and we chose wrong too many times." There was more, apologies, explanations, small admissions about pressure, about fear. At the bottom, a single request. "Please allow us to see Eli, if and when he's ready." I didn't answer right away, but I didn't throw the letter out either. Eli found it on the table one evening while helping me sort mail. "Is it from Grandpa and Grandma?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "They want to see you." He was quiet for a moment. "Do we forgive them?" "I think forgiveness is a gift," I told him. "We give it when it's ours to give, not when someone demands it." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe we give it in pieces." A week later, we wrote back. A red envelope, simple and unadorned. Inside, a card Eli helped design with crayons and bakery stickers. On the front, he wrote, "Family means being there even when it's hard." That evening, as we prepared for the anniversary gathering, the warmth in the shop was more than just from the oven. Neighbors came in with small gifts, hand-knitted pot holders, tins of cookies, a birdhouse shaped like a pie. Susan, our lawyer and longtime friend, brought her daughter and helped string up a few strands of white lights near the counter. Someone started singing softly near the back, and it didn't take long before the whole room was humming along. Not carols, but something old, something familiar and slow and full of belonging. Eli tugged at my sleeve and handed me a sheet of lined paper, creased and decorated with snowflake stickers. "I wrote something," he said, "for the celebration." "Can I hear it first?" I asked. He shook his head. "I want everyone to hear it at the same time." So I waited. And when the time came, he climbed onto a step stool and cleared his throat, holding the paper close to his chest. "It's called The Warmth That Grows Back," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the room fell silent to listen. Sometimes families are loud. Sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they forget to look behind them. But sometimes they turn around. And when they do, the parts that hurt can warm again, like bread in an oven or snow in sunlight. My mom taught me that, and Grandma did too, even after she was gone. The room erupted in gentle applause, not thunderous, but tender, like a hug you didn't see coming. Later, after the last guest had gone and the lights were dimmed, Bev sat beside me by the window. Outside, the snow fell again, thicker now. The red ribbon from Grandma's apron fluttered against the doorframe. "I think you've built something real here," she said. I looked across the room at Eli, who was trying to stack mugs higher than seemed physically possible. "I hope so," I whispered. As snow falls again outside the cafe, Eli laughs and Bev refills my coffee. For the first time in years, I feel like I've inherited something real. Some inheritances don't come in bank accounts or deeds. They come quietly, in warm kitchens, handwritten notes, and people who choose to stay. I don't seek justice to win, but to be seen. And in doing so, I've been reminded that quiet kindness is far more powerful than pride. When we stop judging by appearances, we begin to see each other clearly, heart first. Perhaps somewhere in your life, there's a soft voice waiting to be heard, or a cake cooling by the window, that holds more truth than we expect. And maybe, just maybe, kindness, like snow, sticks best when it falls gently.